I signed over my $4 million home to my son believing I was securing his future. 15 minutes later, I was standing outside that same house with a suitcase in my hand while he locked the door behind me. No argument, no hesitation, just a quiet decision that erased everything I thought we were. What he did not know was that in less than a week, everything he thought he had gained would begin to fall apart. And when it did, he would come back to me, not as a son in control, but as someone who finally understood what he almost lost. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 63 years old, and until recently, I believed I understood exactly what mattered in life. I have lived in Charleston, South Carolina for nearly 3 decades in a coastal home that carries more memories than I can count. The house sits just far enough from the water to catch the ocean breeze in the mornings, the kind that makes the curtains move gently as if the walls themselves are breathing. It was never just a house to me. It was where my life was built piece by piece. My husband, William Collins, and I bought that home when our son Daniel was only 5 years old. William was an architect, a man who believed deeply in structure, not just in buildings, but in life. He was thoughtful, steady, and patient. He designed small parts of the house himself over the years, adding details that most people would never notice, but that meant everything to us. A window positioned to catch the sunrise. A porch extended just enough to hold a swing where we would sit in the evenings. Those choices were not about value. They were about living. Daniel grew up in that house surrounded by warmth. I remember him running barefoot across the hardwood floors, his laughter echoing through the hallways. Weekends were simple. We would walk along the shoreline, come back with the sand on our shoes, and sit together for dinner while William told stories about his projects. It was not a glamorous life, but it was full. Everything changed when Daniel turned 17. William died suddenly, without warning. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving behind a silence that settled into every corner of the house. I became a widow overnight, responsible not only for my own grief, but for holding my son together as he struggled to understand what had happened. There was no time to fall apart. Bills continued to arrive, and the future no longer felt certain. So I worked. I started small, managing a single rental property, then another, learning everything through long nights and mistakes I could not afford to repeat. Over time, those efforts grew into a small collection of boutique inns scattered across Charleston. They were modest, carefully maintained, and enough to give me independence. I never became wealthy in the way people imagine, but I became stable. That stability was something I built with my own hands. Daniel, however, never saw the full picture. I made sure of that. I wanted him to focus on school, on building his own future without carrying the weight of mine. He grew into a successful attorney, confident, sharp, and efficient in the way he approached the world. I was proud of him, truly. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. He began to see life in terms of outcomes and results, not the quiet effort behind them. When he married Vanessa Reed, I told myself I would welcome her with an open heart. She was intelligent, composed, and carried herself with a kind of polished confidence that made a strong first impression. But there was something in the way she observed things, a subtle calculation behind her smile that I could not quite ignore. She noticed details others would overlook, especially when it came to money and property. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, every new relationship takes time to settle. But even in those early days, I felt a quiet shift in the air, something I could not yet name. It was not conflict, not yet. It was simply the feeling that the life I had built was beginning to be seen through a different lens, and I did not realize how much that difference would matter until it was too late. If you're still watching and already sensing that something feels off beneath the surface, comment number 1 below so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's move into what really started to change everything. After Daniel married Vanessa, my home began to feel different in ways I could not immediately explain. Nothing obvious changed at first. The furniture remained in the same place, the view from the windows still open toward the same stretch of sky and distant water, and the quiet rhythm of Charleston life continued as it always had. But something subtle shifted beneath the surface, something I could feel long before I could name it. Vanessa started visiting more often. At first, I welcomed it. It felt natural for a newly married couple to spend time with family, and I wanted to build a connection with her. She carried herself with confidence, always composed, always attentive. But as the visits became more frequent, I began to notice how she moved through the house. She did not simply sit or relax the way Daniel used to. She observed. Her eyes lingered on details, the structure of the ceilings, the size of the windows, the layout of the land beyond the back porch. It was not admiration. It felt closer to evaluation. Her questions began gently, almost casually. She would ask how long I had lived there, or whether the neighborhood had changed over the years. At first, those conversations felt harmless. Charleston had grown significantly, and it was natural for someone new to the area to be curious. But over time, the questions shifted. They became more precise, more focused. She began mentioning market trends, property values, and the rising demand for historic coastal homes. I found myself answering politely while a small discomfort settled in my chest. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, Vanessa came from a background where financial awareness was considered practical, even necessary. It made sense that she would see the house as something more than a place to live. Still, there was a difference between awareness and fixation, and I was beginning to feel that difference. Daniel, at first, remained mostly quiet during these conversations. He would nod occasionally, listening more than speaking, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, his language began to change. He started using words that had never been part of our conversations before. Instead of calling it home, he referred to it as property. Instead of memories, he spoke about equity. The shift was subtle, but once I noticed it, I could not ignore it. The conversations themselves also became more structured. What had once felt like spontaneous remarks now carried a sense of preparation, as though the topics had been discussed beforehand. Vanessa would raise a point, and Daniel would expand on it, adding logic and reasoning. Together, they built a narrative that framed the house not as something personal, but as something strategic. One evening, as we sat at the dining table, Daniel mentioned the idea of long-term planning. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. He spoke about avoiding complications in the future, about making decisions early rather than waiting until it was too late. I listened quietly, noticing how easily the conversation flowed between them, how aligned they seemed. For a brief moment, I felt like a guest in my own home, watching a discussion that had already been decided before I entered the room. I told myself to trust him. Daniel was my son. I had raised him, guided him, protected him. Whatever ideas he was exploring now, they must have come from a place of responsibility. That was what I wanted to believe. But beneath that belief, something else lingered. A quiet awareness that the conversation was no longer about possibilities. It was about timing. Not if something would change, but when. If you're still watching and you can feel the tension building in those quiet conversations, comment number 2 below so I know you're with me. Now let's see how one decision turned everything upside down. The conversation that changed everything began on a quiet afternoon in my kitchen, the same place where Daniel had once sat doing his homework while I prepared dinner. The familiarity of the space made what followed feel even more unsettling. Daniel arrived earlier than expected that day, dressed more formally than usual, as if he were stepping into a meeting rather than visiting his mother. Vanessa walked in just behind him, composed as always, her expression unreadable but attentive. At first, the conversation followed its usual rhythm. We spoke about work, about the weather, about small things that did not matter. But there was a tension beneath Daniel's voice that I could not ignore. He was waiting for something, building toward it. I could see it in the way he paused between sentences, in the way Vanessa remained unusually quiet, watching rather than participating. Eventually, Daniel set his coffee cup down and shifted his posture slightly forward. That was when I knew the real conversation was about to begin. He spoke calmly, carefully, choosing his words with precision. He explained that he had been thinking about the future, about long-term planning, about protecting the family's assets. He described potential legal complications that could arise if things were not handled early. The way he presented it made it sound reasonable, even responsible. There was no pressure in his tone, no urgency that could be easily challenged, just logic. But logic can be persuasive in ways emotion cannot. He suggested that transferring the house into his name now would simplify everything later. It would avoid delays, reduce taxes, and ensure that nothing unexpected would interfere with what he described as the natural progression of ownership. Vanessa nodded slightly as he spoke, reinforcing each point without interrupting. It was clear they had discussed this before. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting quietly on the table. Inside, however, something resisted. Not loudly, not enough to form a clear objection, but enough to create discomfort. The house was not just an asset to me, no matter how carefully Daniel framed it. It held a part of my life that could not be measured. Still, he was my son. When he finally asked if I would consider transferring the property, his voice softened just slightly. It was the only moment where emotion surfaced, and it was enough. Nodded, though not without hesitation. I told him I would agree, but only if we used my attorney. That condition seemed to surprise him for a brief second, but he accepted it quickly. Vanessa said nothing, but her silence felt deliberate. A few days later, we met at Thomas Green's office in downtown Charleston. The building was old, its walls lined with dark wood and shelves of legal volumes that gave the space a quiet authority. Thomas greeted us with his usual professionalism, but I noticed the subtle pause when I explained the purpose of the meeting. He asked me more than once if I was certain. I told him I was. The documents were laid out neatly across the table. Thomas explained each section in detail, taking his time, making sure the language was clear. I listened carefully, but I also noticed how Daniel's attention drifted. He nodded occasionally, but his eyes moved ahead, as if he were already past this step. Vanessa remained still, her focus fixed, but she did not ask a single question. Thomas pointed out the residency clause, explaining that I would retain the right to live in the house for the rest of my life. Then he mentioned an additional provision, one that allowed for a reversal of ownership under specific circumstances. He did not emphasize it, but he did not hide it either. Daniel waved it off as standard detail. Vanessa gave a small nod, as if confirming the same assumption. When the moment came to sign, I hesitated only briefly. My name felt heavier than usual as I wrote it across the page. It was not just ink, it was trust. When it was done, Daniel looked relieved. Vanessa allowed herself the smallest hint of satisfaction. As we left the office, something felt off. The process had been too smooth, too quick, as if everyone had been rushing toward an outcome they had already accepted. I believed I had just secured my son's future. I did not realize I had just set something else in motion. If you're still watching and wondering why something about that agreement didn't sit right, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. Now, let's see what happened the moment we got back home. We drove back to the house in separate cars after leaving Thomas Green's office. The afternoon light in Charleston had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the streets as I followed Daniel's car through familiar turns I had made thousands of times before. Everything about the drive felt ordinary, but there was a quiet unease settling inside me, a feeling I could not fully explain. When I stepped through the front door, the house greeted me the way it always had, with stillness, with warmth, with the faint scent of wood and salt carried in from the coast. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that nothing had changed, but that illusion did not last. Daniel closed the door behind us, and something shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The atmosphere tightened, the ease that had always defined this space replaced by something more deliberate. Vanessa moved toward the center of the room, her posture composed, her eyes already scanning the space as if seeing it differently now. Daniel began speaking almost immediately. There was no transition, no easing into the conversation. He talked about renovations, about updating the structure, about modernizing the layout. His tone was steady, practical, as if everything he was saying was simply the next logical step. Vanessa added details, mentioning design plans, timelines, and potential value increases once the work was completed. I listened, but my attention was no longer on the words. It was on the pace. Everything was happening too quickly. Then Daniel said it. He explained that during the renovation process, it would be better if I stayed somewhere else. He described it as temporary, as a matter of convenience. The construction would be disruptive, he said, and it would only make sense for me to relocate until everything was finished. Temporary. The word lingered in the air, soft enough to sound harmless, but vague enough to mean anything. I felt a quiet question rise inside me. How long would temporary be? A few weeks? A few months? Something longer? But I did not ask it out loud. Instead, I looked at him, searching for something in his expression that would clarify what he had not said. He avoided my eyes. Vanessa stepped in, her tone calm, almost reassuring. She spoke about practicality, about efficiency, about how this would make the entire process smoother. There was no hesitation in her voice, no acknowledgement of what this moment actually meant. To her, it was a decision already made. That was when I noticed the suitcase. It sat near the door, placed neatly against the wall as if it had always belonged there. My suitcase, the one I used for short trips, for weekends away, not for leaving my home. I stared at it for a moment, trying to understand what I was seeing. They had packed it, not after asking me, not after discussing options, but before. The decision had been made long before I walked back into the house. This conversation was not about deciding anything. It was about informing me. A strange calm settled over me then, replacing the shock I might have expected to feel. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. The truth was already in front of me. I walked slowly through the living room, letting my eyes rest on the familiar details. The chair by the window where William used to sit, the hallway where Daniel had once run as a child, the light falling across the floor exactly the way it always had. For a moment, it felt like I was seeing everything for the last time. When I returned to the door, I picked up the suitcase without a word. It was lighter than I expected. Daniel said something then, something about not making things more difficult than they needed to be. I did not respond. There was nothing left to say. I stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet sounds of the evening. Behind me, the door closed. A second later, I heard the lock. It was not loud, but it was final. I stood there for a moment, holding the suitcase, looking at the house that had once been mine in every sense that mattered. Then I turned and walked toward my car. They believed they had taken everything from me. They had no idea what they had overlooked. If you're still watching and felt that moment hit harder than expected, comment number 4 below so I know you're still following closely. Now, let's see how everything began to fall apart. That night, I stayed in one of the smaller rooms at a boutique inn I owned on the quieter side of Charleston. It was a place I had always considered temporary, a space meant for travelers passing through, not for someone like me who had spent nearly 3 decades rooted in one home. The room was clean, carefully arranged, and filled with soft, neutral tones designed to make strangers feel comfortable. But comfort, I realized, is not the same as belonging. The silence felt different there. In my house, silence had always carried memories. It had weight, but it was familiar. Here, it felt hollow, like something unfinished. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, my suitcase resting against the wall, still closed. I had not found the energy to unpack it. It seemed unnecessary, as though opening it would somehow confirm that what had happened was real. My mind kept returning to the same image, the suitcase by the door, not the argument that never happened, not the words that were said or left unsaid, but that single detail. It was proof that everything had been decided before I had the chance to respond. That realization settled deeper with each passing hour, not as anger, but as clarity. Later that evening, I took out the folder Thomas Green had given me and reviewed the documents again. The language was precise, deliberate, and far more protective than Daniel had understood. The residency clause was clear. I had the legal right to live in that house for the rest of my life. More importantly, the additional provision regarding ownership reversal was still there, quietly embedded within the agreement. I closed the folder and placed it beside the bed. I understood my position now. I was not powerless, but I also knew that acting too quickly would change the nature of what was unfolding. Some lessons cannot be explained. They have to be experienced. Meanwhile, I could imagine exactly what was happening in the house I had just left behind. Daniel and Vanessa were likely moving through each room with a sense of ownership, discussing plans, measuring spaces, envisioning changes. To them, this was the beginning of something new, something exciting. The house was no longer a place to live. It was a project. Within days, Daniel began taking steps to move forward with those plans. He contacted a bank to initiate a refinancing process, intending to use the property's value to fund renovations. On the surface, it made sense. The house was worth millions, and with updates, it could be worth even more. It was a straightforward financial strategy, one that relied on the assumption that everything was now under his control. But assumptions have consequences. When the bank reviewed the property records, they found the residency clause. It was not a minor detail. It was a restriction that limited how the property could be used and introduced a level of risk that financial institutions are not willing to accept. Without full control over the property, Daniel could not proceed the way he had planned. At first, I imagined he was confused, then frustrated, and eventually, something closer to panic began to take hold. What made the situation worse was something Daniel had not yet fully realized. Vanessa had already moved forward with her own plans. Without telling him everything, she had leveraged the house in discussions tied to a separate investment opportunity. It was a risk she believed was justified, assuming the property would be fully accessible. But when the financing fell through, that assumption collapsed. The pressure began to build quickly. Financial commitments had been made, expectations had been set, and now the foundation beneath all of it was unstable. I did not need to see it to understand it. I could feel the shift even from a distance. I remained where I was, quiet, still, waiting. The house was never the problem. It was what they had already tied to it that would bring everything down. A few days passed after the bank refused Daniel's request, and in that short time, everything shifted. I could feel it even without being there. Pressure has a way of changing people quickly, especially when it exposes what they failed to consider. I remained in my room at the inn, moving through each day with quiet routine, allowing the situation to unfold without interference. I did not reach out. I did not ask questions. I waited. The call came sooner than I expected. My phone rang early in the morning, Daniel's name appearing on the screen. I let it ring once, then twice, before answering. His voice sounded different, strained in a way I had never heard before. There was no confidence in it, no sense of control, only urgency. He asked about the clause in the contract, the one he had not paid attention to. He wanted to understand why the bank had refused his application, why something he believed was simple had suddenly become complicated. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I reminded him calmly that everything had been explained during the meeting with Thomas Green. He had been there. He had chosen not to listen. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a shift in his tone. The frustration softened into something closer to concern. He explained that the bank would not proceed unless the residency clause was removed. Then he asked if I would consider signing a waiver. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I asked him a different question. I asked what he planned to do with the house once the renovations were complete. The silence that followed was enough. He did not need to say it. I already knew. The house had never been meant to remain a home in his plans. It was always intended to become something else. He eventually admitted that they had considered selling it. Not immediately, he said, but eventually. The words came slowly, as if he understood what they meant now that he was saying them out loud. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, but certainty. He went on to explain that financial commitments had already been made. Contractors were waiting. Deposits had been placed. Without the loan, everything would begin to collapse. In the background, I could hear Vanessa's voice, quiet but insistent, guiding him toward solutions, pushing him to keep the conversation focused on outcomes. I let him finish before responding. I told him we needed to meet in person, not at the house. That space no longer belonged to the conversation we needed to have. I gave him the address of the inn and told him to come later that day. He agreed without hesitation. After the call ended, I contacted Thomas Green. I explained what had happened and asked him to confirm my position. His response was steady, as I expected. The agreement was clear. My rights remained intact. The trust structure connected to the property was still active, and more importantly, the larger framework I had not yet revealed was still in place. When I ended that call, I understood exactly what I needed to do. Daniel arrived that afternoon with Vanessa beside him. The difference in him was immediate. His posture was tighter, his movements less certain. Vanessa, however, remained composed, though there was a sharpness in her expression that had not been there before. I let them speak first. They explained the situation again, this time with less confidence and more urgency. The conversation circled around solutions, around options, around what could be done to move forward. But none of it addressed what had already happened. When they finished, I spoke. I told them about the Collins family trust. The reaction was immediate. Daniel looked stunned, as if something fundamental had just shifted beneath him. Vanessa's expression changed as well, but in a different way. Her focus sharpened, her attention narrowing as she processed the implications. I explained that the trust held assets far greater than the house. I explained that Daniel was the primary beneficiary, and then I explained the condition attached to it. Silence filled the room. For the first time, my son was no longer asking how to take control. He was asking what he had already lost. If you're still watching and realizing this story is much bigger than just a house, comment number 6 below so I know you're with me. Now let's move into chapter 7, where the consequences finally surface. The room fell into a silence that felt heavier than anything that had been said before. After I explained the structure of the Collins family trust and the condition attached to it, neither Daniel nor Vanessa spoke immediately. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes from understanding something too clearly, too suddenly. I watched them both carefully. Daniel sat still, his shoulders slightly slumped, his gaze unfocused as if he were replaying every decision that had led to this moment. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained upright, her posture controlled, but her eyes sharper now, moving quickly as she tried to assess what this new information meant. I continued, not to pressure them, but to make sure there was no misunderstanding. The trust was not simply a financial structure, it was designed with intention. Daniel was named as the primary beneficiary, but the inheritance was not unconditional. It depended on how he treated me, on whether he acted with respect and responsibility toward the one person his father had trusted to carry everything forward. Daniel's expression changed as the weight of that settled in. It was no longer about the house. It was no longer about a single decision. It was about everything. Vanessa was the first to respond. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it now. She questioned how something like that could be enforced, suggesting that it sounded more like a personal preference than a legal condition. I met her gaze without raising my voice. The structure of the trust was valid, carefully written, and fully enforceable. There was nothing unclear about it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands pressed together as if trying to steady himself. He asked what this meant for him, not in terms of money, but in terms of consequence. That distinction mattered. It told me he was beginning to understand. Before I could answer, the tension between him and Vanessa began to surface. He turned toward her, asking questions he had not asked before. There was something in his tone that had shifted. It was no longer agreement. It was doubt. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that there were details he had not fully known. Vanessa had moved forward with financial decisions that relied heavily on assumptions about the house, assumptions that were no longer valid. The investment she had tied to the property was not as secure as she had presented it, and the pressure it created was now impossible to ignore. Daniel's reaction was not immediate anger. It was something quieter, more unsettling. A realization that he had trusted someone without fully understanding the risks involved. That realization extended beyond Vanessa. It reached back to me, to the moment he had asked me to leave, to the choices he had made without hesitation. I felt no sense of victory watching this unfold, only a quiet sadness. Daniel tried to explain himself then, but the words lacked direction. He spoke about intentions, about planning, about doing what he thought was right. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that those reasons could not hold the weight of what had actually happened. I told him calmly that this was not about punishment. It was about consequence. Every decision carries one, whether we choose to see it or not. Vanessa pushed back again, calling the situation unreasonable, suggesting that I was overreacting to something that could still be fixed. But her words no longer carried the same influence. Daniel was no longer listening to her the way he had before. He looked at me instead, and for the first time since he walked into that room, he asked a question that mattered. What could be done? I did not answer immediately, because the damage had already been done. The only question left was whether it could be undone. The room remained quiet after Daniel asked what could be done. It was not the same silence as before. This one felt different, heavier, but also clearer, as if something unspoken had finally settled into place. I watched him carefully. The tension that had once driven his words was gone. In its place was something more honest, something uncertain, but real. Vanessa stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly, her frustration no longer hidden. She was still calculating, still searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But the balance had shifted. Daniel was no longer following her lead. I took a slow breath before speaking again. There was something else they needed to understand. I told them that the trust was not the only protection that had been put in place. Before any of this happened, I had already begun preparing a different path for those assets. If Daniel had continued on the course he chose 5 days ago, if he had treated me as something disposable rather than as his mother, a significant portion of what remained would have been transferred to charitable organizations. I had set a time frame, 7 days. We were already close to that point. The effect was immediate. Daniel's expression shifted again, but this time it was not shock alone. It was realization. The situation was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, and it was irreversible if he failed to understand what mattered. Vanessa reacted first, her voice sharper than before. She questioned the fairness of that decision, suggesting that it was extreme, that it went beyond reason. But I did not respond to her argument. This was not about fairness in the way she understood it. It was about intention, about the choices that had already been made. I explained that this had never been about taking something away. It was about ensuring that what William and I had built would not be reduced to a transaction. He had trusted that the future of our family would be shaped by respect, not by opportunity. Daniel lowered his gaze, absorbing every word. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the confidence it once carried. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply acknowledged that he had been wrong, not in the sense of a mistake, but in the way he had approached everything, the assumptions he had made, the way he had allowed himself to treat something meaningful as something expendable. Vanessa tried once more to redirect the conversation, focusing on the financial implications, on what could still be recovered. But Daniel did not respond to her this time. The distance between them was no longer subtle. It was clear, defined by the choices each of them was willing to make. I watched him for a moment longer before speaking again. I told him that I was not interested in punishment. I was interested in restoring balance. The house would not remain in his control. It would be placed within the trust where it belonged, protected from decisions driven by urgency or profit. He would still be allowed to live there, but the conditions would be clear. The house could not be sold. It could not be used as leverage. It would remain what it had always been meant to be. A home. Vanessa shook her head, unable to accept what that meant. To her, it was a loss, a limitation, something taken away. But Daniel saw it differently. He nodded slowly, not out of agreement with the situation, but out of understanding. He recognized what was being offered, not control, but a second chance. As I stood there, looking at him, I felt something shift inside me as well. The anger that could have taken root never did. What remained was something steadier. For the first time in days, I was not losing my son. I was watching him become someone I could still recognize. If you're still watching and wondering whether everything can truly be repaired after this, comment number 8 below, so I know you're still here. Now, let's move into the final outcome of this story. In the days that followed our conversation, everything became quieter. Not in the sense that problems disappeared, but in the way that noise gives way to something more stable after a storm has passed. I remained at the inn for a short time, allowing space to exist where tension once filled every moment. For the first time in nearly a week, I was no longer waiting for something to happen. It already had. The legal process moved forward exactly as it needed to. The house was formally placed into the Collins Family Trust, securing it in a way that removed the urgency that had driven so many poor decisions. It was no longer something to be negotiated or leveraged. It was protected. When I returned to the house, I did so without hesitation. The door opened the same way it always had, the hinges familiar, the air inside unchanged. But the meaning of that space had shifted. It was no longer just a place filled with memories. It had become something else as well, a boundary, a reminder that what we value must sometimes be defended, even from those we love. Daniel was there when I arrived. He did not greet me with confidence or expectation. Instead, there was a quiet awareness in the way he stood, as though he understood that nothing about this moment could be taken for granted. Over the next few days, I noticed the changes in him not through words, but through small actions. He moved more carefully, spoke less, and listened more. He began helping without being asked, handling simple things that he once would have overlooked. There was no attempt to undo what had been done, only an effort to move forward differently. Vanessa, however, remained distant. The certainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something less stable. The tension between her and Daniel was no longer hidden. It existed quietly, beneath the surface, in the spaces between conversations that never fully happened. I did not interfere. That was something they would have to resolve on their own. As for Daniel and me, our relationship was not what it had been before. There are moments in life that change things permanently, and this was one of them. But it was not broken. It was different, and sometimes different is enough. I thought back to the night I stood outside with the suitcase in my hand, the sound of the door locking behind me still clear in my memory. That moment could not be erased, but it no longer defined everything that came after. Some things cannot be undone, but they can be understood, and sometimes that is enough to begin again. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something that resembled normal, though I understood it would never be the same as before. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, but it does not erase what has already been carved into memory. What it does instead is offer perspective, and with that, a clearer understanding of what truly matters. For a long time, I believed that the house was the center of everything. It held my past, my family, and the life I had built alongside my husband. But what I came to realize is that the house was never the most valuable thing I had. It was simply the place where those values lived. The real weight of the story was never about property. It was about how easily something meaningful can be reduced to a number when people forget where it came from. As a mother, I gave everything I could to Daniel. I worked so that he would not have to struggle the way I did. I protected him from the harder parts of life, believing that love meant removing obstacles from his path. But in doing so, I may have also removed his ability to see what those sacrifices were worth. That was a lesson I had to accept as much as he did. What happened between us was not just about betrayal. It was about misunderstanding. Daniel saw opportunity where I saw memory. He saw potential where I saw history. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but without respect, those differences became something destructive. I learned that love without boundaries can become vulnerability, and boundaries, when set with clarity, are not acts of rejection. They are acts of preservation. Daniel learned something as well. Ownership does not create entitlement, and family is not a transaction to be negotiated. It is something that must be cared for, even when it is inconvenient, even when it does not align with immediate gain. Not everything was repaired. Some things take longer. Some things may never return to what they were. But there is still something left, and sometimes that is enough. In the end, The most valuable thing I ever owned was never the house. It was the lesson it forced us all to learn. In life, the things we believe we own often turn out to be the very things that test us. A house, a legacy, a lifetime of effort can seem like the center of everything, yet none of it holds true value without respect, understanding, and the ability to see beyond ourselves. Time has a way of revealing what matters most, not through comfort, but through conflict. And sometimes, it is only when something is almost lost that its true meaning becomes clear. Real wealth is never measured in numbers, but in the strength of the bonds we choose to protect. If this story made you reflect on your own life or relationships, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you enjoy stories that carry meaning, consider following and subscribing for more.